This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Hey, everybody. This episode of Andrew Petty is Dying was recorded back in mid-June of this year, 2024, and it's been 8 or so weeks since I've published an episode of Andrew Petty is Dying for a variety of reasons, none of which deserve much going into at this point. But those reasons do contribute to the existence of this preamble to this episode, which I'm recording now at the beginning of October 2024. And specifically, some of the things that have occurred since mid-June, since I last published an episode, have led me to begin to conclude that it's time to begin winding down Andrew Petty is Dying, and at least pushing indefinite pause on it, if not stopping production altogether, for a variety of reasons, one of which includes stage of life and other priorities that have come up. I feel ready to hang up the microphone on this podcast, which first came into existence in April of 2020, right as the pandemic, the COVID ordeal was becoming a thing. It was coincidental timing, not anything strategic on my part. And for the past, 4.5-ish years, I've been releasing pretty much consistently every 2 weeks. And that discipline has been tremendously useful and helpful and instructive, both in just the maintaining of the discipline and also in what I have learned from the actual process of having conversations with wonderful people who've had pretty extraordinary encounters with mortality. Those conversations have changed my life dramatically. They have impacted a lot of you, I know. And then in the case of solo episodes, I've had to come up with a concept to share that is intelligible and useful and coherent. And that discipline, that process has been amazingly helpful as well. So over the course of the past 4.5 years, I've gotten much clearer on what I think and how I perceive this existence on this planet and what matters more than other things. And along the way, my own fear of mortality has largely vaporized, and I have been emboldened and in many ways saved and healed by this regular voluntary confrontation with mortality. So now 4.5 years in, I'm just realizing my energy for this particular podcast is waning, and my interests are moving elsewhere in perhaps the podcast world, but just onto other topics. And I am ready to devote more time and energy to those things than I am to this specific podcast. And so all of the things remaining equal, and they rarely do. But at this point, I'm planning to conclude Andrew Petty is Dying with not this episode, but one to follow it, which would be a solo episode, a parting shot, a final word, so to speak, at least as it has to do with this podcast. What else is useful to say at this point? I probably already said more than needs to be said and been more long-winded than I needed to be, but there will be another occasion for farewells and official signing off. But in this moment, simply to say, I foresee that this podcast is coming to a close as my heart and mind move on to other things. And I look forward to one final, probably solo episode, but maybe not, on some things I've been chewing on that I want to be sure to put on deposit with you before I sign off from this episode, from this podcast. So without further ado, let's move on to today's episode with my good friend, colleague, and sometimes mentor, Dr. Michael Barnes. Welcome to Andrew Petty is Dying once again, and I'm excited about today's episode with someone who I've come to know well over the past few years and have enjoyed as a colleague and a friend, Dr. Mike Barnes. Mike and I met in 2018 here in Steamboat when he was also here in Steamboat. He now resides in Florida, but was also here in Steamboat on the staff of the Foundry, a local addiction treatment and recovery. And I had the good fortune of being an executive coach to the Foundry for a number of years. And so Mike got tangled up in that, tangled up in that work somewhere along the way. And of course, we both have the best personality style, according to Myers-Briggs, that anyone can have. And I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but we're both INFPs. And so, the sense in which there was a simpatico right away. But Mike has taught me a lot about human condition, humans under stress in the midst of addiction and recovery and trauma. Taught me a lot about the clinical space and some of the principles that are in place there. And he's been in the therapeutic and especially the addiction treatment and trauma world, something of an innovator and a thought leader around how to deal with individuals and family systems that are in the grips of trauma and addiction. And so I feel like I've had this sort of, just like, what would I say? Just a free sort of master's class whenever Mike and I are able to talk about those kinds of things. It's really helped me a lot in my own work as a coach. I'm not a therapist, but we borrow a lot as coaches from the psychological world and the study of the human condition that comes out of that world. And I have a lot of respect for Mike for a lot of reasons, of course, for the work he's done, and we'll delve more into the work that he's done and that he's currently doing. But one of the things that I respect most about Mike is that with as many letters as he has behind his name, credential-wise, I've always found him willing and able and eager to learn from anyone and anything. And I don't think it's common to find people with as much academic pedigree as someone like Mike has, who has that attitude. So it really speaks well and highly to me of who he is as a person and his character, and it speaks also highly of the nature of the work that he does and the quality of the work that he does, because if you're in a situation where you need critical help, and Mike and his team are involved regularly with people who need critical help, you want to be treated by someone who has humility, who understands the limits of their capacity and their knowledge, and at the same time also is confidently possessed of their capacity and their knowledge. And Mike seems to me to be someone who strikes a good balance in that regard. Mike has recently written a book called When the Solution Becomes the Problem, helping families struggling with addiction and trauma. And Mike, I ripped this right off your website. The summary for it says, when the solution becomes the problem takes a unique approach to families and addiction. Rather than offering prescriptive advice, it partners with families to understand why implementing expert recommendations can be challenging. Through relatable stories and clinical descriptions, the book explores addiction, trauma, and resilience. It guides families toward healing and a renewed sense of togetherness, emphasizing recovery from addiction and trauma as a collective journey. And I think that final phrase there is probably a pretty significant one in terms of the approach that you're recommending and that we all continue to consider and evolve in. So that's where we're headed today on this episode of Andrew Petty is Dying with Dr. Mike Barnes, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's great to see you.
Likewise. And this is sort of the bookend of a conversation we began a few weeks ago on your YouTube channel, where we were talking about some of the concepts I've been developing over time that may integrate well into the recovery world. And so it's fun to be able to follow that up and continue to tease out any thoughts that the two of us might find that might be of value to other people. We're going to start first, Mike, not with your book, which will be the how we'll land the plane today, but I would be remiss if on Andrew Petty is Dying, I didn't take the opportunity to delve into a crisis that you and your family experienced many moons ago now involving your son, Patrick. It was, in fact, an encounter with mortality. Would you tell us what happened?
Yeah, I was just starting my second semester of my doctoral program at Florida State University. And I was in the clinic where, you're always on campus doing something in those days. And I came out of a supervision class, and there was a police officer standing there. And he said, "Are you the father of this kid?" And I started joking with him, like, he's 5 years old. What did he do to get arrested, Just goofing off like I usually do. And the police officer said, "You need to just sit down and be quiet. Like, this is really serious." He said, "Your son's been hit by a car. He's in Tallahassee Regional, and everything's going to be fine. Just relax. Don't get into an accident. Rush into the hospital. And it's so interesting how my very first thought is the classic thought that so many people have, and that is this doesn't happen to us. This
Mhm.
happens to other people. Like
You were really conscious of that thought entering your mind in
uh,
that moment.
first thought,
Wow.
and that like this is really serious. Like this is what you see in the news. This is like, and I wasn't really. I mean, I was thinking life and death at the time, but I was just thinking, it's like every parent's nightmare
Hmm.
of a child being injured that way. And when I had gone back to school, I had been an addiction counselor for 8 years. And I was going back to learn more about family therapy, working with families in addiction. And so his injuries were severe. And I learned later from one of the nurses that I went back to do a research project a year later after he got out, studying critical care nurses and compassion fatigue and things like that. And this nurse looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, you're the dad of that kid that was here that was hit by the car." And I said, "I have to assume in a city the size of Tallahassee, you deal with kids hit by cars all the time." And she said, "Oh, no, no, your son's story is different."
Hmm.
And I said, "How so?" And she said, he was brought here to die.
Oh my
He,
gosh.
he, his injuries were so severe that no one gave him any chance of surviving.
Did you
Now, of course,
you didn't know that?
they didn't tell it. No,
Oh
no,
my.
no. They were, very much like, we're going to do everything we can do. And so he spent 3 weeks in intensive care, or he spent 2 weeks in intensive care, another 3 weeks in the hospital, months in a body cast, had to learn how to walk, had to learn how to do everything again. He broke his femur in half, split his liver almost in half, split his kidney from top to bottom. And anyone familiar with red ants in Florida, he landed on a red ant pile. And of course, it's night. You can't see what it is, and you can't move them. So he had red ant bites, those little white pimply kind of bites. Fortunately, he had a long sleeve shirt on, so it wasn't everywhere, but it was bad all over his face. And so, I mean, I was working with Vietnam veterans at the time. I was working in the world of trauma every day. And I knew that I had grown up in a family where there was a history of addiction and a lot of trauma in my particularly my mom. But I never really put the pieces together of just how traumatized I was. And this just made it exponentially higher. And
How
so,
traumatized you were prior to this accident?
yeah, just from growing up in that environment. And there's no blame or anything. It's just, it's when there's addiction in a family, when there's almost always trauma in that family. And so, it's interesting. I was teaching a doctoral class once. We were talking about, can you change the past? And every student said, no, past happened. And I'm a firm believer that you can change the past. You can't change what happened, but you can certainly change your understanding of it and people's motives and people's abilities. And one of the things that came out of this was I really began to investigate my own family and my own history and resentments that I had had that I didn't even realize were as big as they were began to surface. And so, as horrible as this was, it had a it gave. I used to kid Patrick. He didn't need to get hit by a car to give me a dissertation topic. I could have figured out my own research. But as bad as that was, we grew so much from that experience. But we were more traumatized than he
Hmm.
was. And he was, pretty physically traumatized. But the thing that I think of is how so the big thing with trauma is not knowing the difference between being safe and feeling safe. That's what so many people will say is I always, I just can't differentiate when I can turn off the nervous system. Like I'm always hypervigilant, I'm always controlling. And that was, and I've done enough research with traumatized families to see that that's the primary coping mechanism for parents when a child has been injured, is to become really vigilant. And I used to joke that we tried to wrap him in bubble wrap so that he could never get hurt again. And of course that just stops the development. And he was actually the one that made me realize it when Sunday morning, my wife, his mom, said, "Hey, do me a favor, go get the Sunday paper down at the mailbox." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I'll do that." And Patrick said, "Well, I'll do it." And she reacted with, "No, no, 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 no." And he looked at her and he says, he's 7 years old, or 6 years old at this time. He said, "What do you think I'm going to do, run out in front of another car? It was an accident." And I looked at my wife and she looked at me and I said, "He's the healthiest person in this family." Like, we have to really start putting our heads together about how we're going to deal with our trauma while allowing him to take the risks that kids need to take to, move through developmental stages. And in so many families that I see, particularly in the addiction world, where there's a young adult who's been wrestling with addiction since he was 12, 13 years old, I will ask, "So what was the trauma that happened in your family when you were a kid?" And they always look surprised, like, "How would you know that?" And it's like, well, it's a pretty common story. And so often there was a miscarriage, or there was, someone had a really life-threatening illness, and that the family adjusts the illness to keep everything going, keep everything functioning. And it's why I called the book "When the Solution Becomes the Problem," because the solution that we identify to be able to live with the trauma while also keeping the family as healthy as possible often becomes a problem, in that the kids don't get to move into the appropriate developmental stages. They find their support with friends in the using world. We talk about moving from the culture of recovery or sobriety into the culture of addiction at a fairly early age. And so,
Can I jump in real quick? Is
sure.
that in part because the solution that we instinctively attempt to apply is attempting to we apply the wrong solution, and that's why the solution becomes the problem, as
Yeah.
we apply a solution that is meant to avoid all future possibilities of something at all like that.
Yeah, it's the solution is really to take care of our emotional state, which is managed by controlling everything around us. And while that feels logical at the time, in the long run creates more problems than it solves.
You've now had what, 20. Well, first of all, let's just clarify for everyone listening that Patrick, your son, is alive to this day.
Yes,
In fact, you're
he's,
taking care of his family's dog this weekend. So Patrick is
yes,
remarkably alive and well after,
yes.
according to that nurse, receiving an assumptive death sentence after the accident. So as a parent, my goodness, I can't imagine. I've got two boys out roaming the town right now on their bikes with their friends. Stuff happens. And I'm so glad that he made it.
Yeah, he's 37, so it's 32
Oh, 32
years
years. Okay.
since the accident.
Yeah.
And there was a time where he would say, like, he doesn't even remember it.
Hmm.
And he'll say, "Tell me the story of the accident." And it's like, why do you want to know? Like, I can tell you, but let's talk about what it is that you
Hmm.
want out of that story. And
Well, but he loves having a dad as a therapist, right?
yeah,
He won't
right.
just give him the
Yeah,
information. He's got to ask what's.
yeah. We got to have an hour session before I can
That's
do
right.
that. And but it's not. It's interesting when you think of how trauma memories are processed. The left side of the brain goes to sleep, and the left side of the brain is the analytical side, where language is. And so when traumas are happening, when that side shuts off, the only thing we really remember are the sensory experiences that we had during the trauma. And the story that we remember is really a combination of what we think happened with all the sensory experiences that we have.
Sort of a
And
composite that we assemble
yes,
after the fact. And
yes.
how much do other people's accounts of the same story play into that composite?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've worked with a lot of families. Let's just start with the idea that I've worked with a lot of families where there was an event that happened to all of them, and they never remember the story the same. And so much of it is context and where they were in relation to it, how much access they had to the actual event itself. And so it's not unusual for family members to say, "Man, that's not how I remember it at
Mm-hmm.
all." I don't. I was here, not where you said I was. Those kinds of things. What's really interesting about trauma memories is they're what we call semantic, meaning it's what we think is what happened, not they're not factual, and that the more we tell it, the more it changes. And so that's why when Patrick says, "Tell me the story," that I want to know what does he want to know, because it's a story at this point. It's it's not factual. I've been through it so many different times. It's taken on multiple kind of like insights and things I remember. And he really says he doesn't remember.
Well,
I mean, he remembers the hospital, but
you say it's a story, not a factual account, or you said something like that. So,
yeah,
what
yeah.
do you mean by that? Is it in a sense fictitious, or are you meaning that the story has become? What do you mean by that?
So let's just say I always give the example of I was at my granddaughter's birthday party recently, and if we think about information comes into a part of our brain, all of our sensory data, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, comes in, and some of it goes to our prefrontal cortex where we start to memorize it and we remember what happened. Some goes to our amygdala, to the limbic system, to assess, is this new information? Is this something we need to be wary of? But if it's fun, then that fight flight system gets shut down and the left side of our brain stays active and alert. And so while we're having all of these sensory pieces of information coming in, we're also creating a narrative of the story to put the pieces together. And so if I were to tell the story of what happened 10 times in a row, of the balloons and the kids laughing and all of those things, I would tell the same story 10 times in a row. And there might be certain things that are a little different based on who I'm talking to, maybe that was there, and those kinds of things. But we have a narrative story as well as our memories of the sight sounds. And when trauma memories happen, it's so scary that we don't have the narrative story. That part of our brain, it's here in the prefrontal cortex, called the Broca area of our brain, actually turns off. And so we don't have language. Bessel van der Kolk, who's a very famous researcher, calls it, of course I have a mind lapse, but like the speechless terror, that the trauma is so terrifying and that without having language, we can't even describe it. And so when it's over, the story doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. All it has is this sensory data. And so that we have to, like, my granddaughter's birthday party is over. I remember it ending,
Mm.
and I remember in my narrative. And so when I used to watch Patrick walk around the house, because if he was limping or he was showing any sign of discomfort, that I had to monitor that as much as possible. And so what I was really looking for were the same sensory experiences I had throughout his trauma experience. And when if I were to see him limp, I would go into a full fight flight response of like the trauma is still happening. It hasn't ended. And so that probably sounds really strange to the listener, that we don't really remember it. But it's pretty like, so there are a couple different theories about memory. One is that we don't remember it, that the information is so under processed because parts of the brain are asleep. And then there are other theories that say we over process it, that we become representative of the trauma, that we are traumatized and see ourselves as that, and that's what causes all that hypervigilance and control. And I'm probably getting into way more detail than we had intended to, but I think it's important when we start talking about these memories that we realize that the reason my trauma is ongoing, meaning my symptoms are ongoing, is because trauma memories are timeless, meaning until we have processed them in therapy to come up with a solution, and that if anything like that were to happen again, and to be able to really talk it through and to create the most logical sequence of things that happened, then we can begin to let go of some of that, and we can begin to allow ourselves to be and not be so limited by our fears and by our anxieties. So,
Well, the word that's coming up in my mind as you talk about this is that it's as if a big part of us is hijacked by the trauma, and until whatever has been taken captive within us is liberated through resources and processes that directly address those things, then the hijacking persists, and then I would assume has compounding effects over time. The collateral damage ensues without sufficient tending. But we can be hijacked by that. I mean, I've got what I have come to appreciate as a form of trauma that probably, and you can tell me, doctor, how accurate this is, but armchair psychologizing. I already had, at the time that my second son was born, a baseline higher level of anxiety than most humans, because I had anxiety disorder. And when my younger son was born, it came with a fair number of complications, and that was after my first son had been born with a fair number of complications and an emergency C-section. And then he had, in his first few years of life, at least one winter where he was sick like every 2 weeks, from probably, I don't know, November to April. And he would, Marshall doesn't just get sick. I mean, if he gets a fever, he gets as high a fever as you can get. If he gets, some respiratory thing, he just gets. And so I would redline as soon as he got sick anyway, because I would, in my predisposition anxiety, immediately catastrophize the thing. But then he kept doing it. And so we would have this brief break of a week, and we'd think, okay, maybe it's over. And then he would resume. And strangely, I think, and then he had a febrile seizure when he was 7. We found him in bed seizing, didn't know what was going on, had an ER visit, all that kind of stuff. And so then there were numerous experiences with him that I realized had created this hijacking within me, because anytime Marshall would get anything, if he would begin to cough a little bit, cough was always a precursor for something coming on for Marshall, I would immediately get hijacked and assume something terrible is coming. It feels a little bit silly to talk about trauma in relationship to, like bacterial and viral things that your kid experiences. And maybe I was, I had a hair trigger with that because of my anxiety already. But I came to realize a few years ago, like, I've got a traumatic response to this. It's inordinate. It's not appropriate to the actual situation
absolutely.
we're dealing with.
Yeah, but think about so what's happening is you had this first child who had medical complications that had the potential to be, really dangerous, and you had a propensity to anxiety anyway. And so with the second child, anytime you would see anything sensory wise that reminded you of your first son's struggles, it's timeless. The brain reacts as if it's happening over again. And that makes, that's, unfortunately, that's how it works.
Yeah.
And then you think about, like in my dissertation, I was writing about secondary trauma, which is me being traumatized by my day-to-day interactions with a traumatized child, and then what I called systemic trauma, which is what happens when you have multiple people in the same house, all of whom are traumatized in slightly different ways. And so, and everything from parenting changes and arguments and a lack of feeling in control, a lack of feeling supported, that it's not just So it's funny. I've been speaking a lot lately around the country on the idea that I think we have trauma all wrong.
Hmm.
We have this sort of view that it's linear, that an event happens, a person experiences it, they have symptoms, they go to therapy, and they get better. I don't think that's how it works. I think when we have people around us that love us and care about us, an event happens, person experiences it. Everyone around them who cares about them is now experiencing fear, threat, frustration, grief, whatever, secondary trauma, and that now there's this interplay between the person who experienced the traumatic event to where they might think, I have to hide my symptoms because my mom gets so upset anytime she thinks that I'm regressing back into it, the trauma, or I have to like argue to get to stop them from being part of my, controlling my life so I can live my life. And so it's what I call recursive. It's always
Hmm.
bouncing back and forth. It's always impacting each other. And I don't, not always, but when things are difficult. And so, the idea of in recovery, well, if my son would just get sober, we could go back to normal. Well, the normal ship sailed a long time ago. Like that ship that was prior to the addiction, because, addiction is a progressive illness, meaning the person doesn't start with the worst consequences, they start with the minor consequences. And that the family has been making these really subtle changes to try to get it stopped. And clearly, if it continues, if it stops, that's great. Then they go, the old normal is able to be maintained. And by normal, I mean the rules of communication and the roles in the family, those kinds of things.
Mike, you said the family. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to catch one thing you said really quickly. You said the family works hard to try to get it stopped, and it seems very likely that that's the point at which the it that the family identifies isn't the right it. They're trying to address the presenting symptom, which of course is important and appropriate to address, but they're failing to miss whatever is beneath it as a catalyzing force.
Well, the it and at that point is the drinking or the drug use, and rather than, so what's causing this? What's going on with my son that this is what he's struggling with, or my daughter that this is what they're struggling with, and how is it impacting us? And is my reaction to it helping or not helping? And I mean, it's always done with the greatest love, and it's always done with the desire to be you know helpful. But sometimes, just like when you experience your son starting to get sick, the nervous system activates, and we behave in certain ways that might be hijacked beyond what we would have intended to do or what we would have hoped to do, or us trying to control Patrick so that he was always
Mm-hmm.
safe didn't had the potential to be really really catastrophically a terrible solution
Mm-hmm.
to a problem that would have been a good one to solve our problem but not his problem. And so that's one of the things that I found in my dissertation, was that people's perception of the what the problem is really critical, in that we're kind of biologically programmed to do what we think is the right thing to do. And so if I grew up in a family with addiction, which my grandfather was an alcoholic, and my mother grew up in that family, then how she would have, if I had developed addiction early on, then her first impressions would be, I understand what this is, I'm going to do whatever I think is the right thing. And if she grew up in a family where she never learned what the right way to manage it was, that in fact the solution could become the problem pretty quick, pretty fast. And so what we in family therapy we call it a first order change. And a first order change is, I'm not going to change my belief system at all. I'm just going to just try the things that I've always been trying because they're the right things. I believe that they're right because they fit my understanding of the problem. But I'm going to try them harder. I'm going to try them more. I'm going to, be more insistent that this is what happens. And
Double down
the old,
effectively.
yeah, and the old story is, more of the same always results in more of the same. And so much of the therapy that we do these days is really focused on helping the family understand the problem differently, because new insights allow for new solutions. New solutions allow for new behaviors. New behaviors allow for healthier relationships, and healthier relationships allow the family to heal in their progression through the recovery process. But if I don't get new insights, then I'm probably not going to get a whole lot of new solutions. And I get asked all the time, so what do you think we should do? And I used to just tell people, and I realized that they very rarely ever did it. And then I started thinking about it, and I think a lot of times people ask that question to see if we're on the same page, to see if how supportive I'm going to be when I ask that question. And so I was watching a video by Simon Sinek, and I read his book, Starts With Why. And he says that people ask you that question all the time. What should we do and how should we do it? And they rarely do it because the why has to shift. It can't be the same why from the perspective of asking. It has to be a new why. And so I spend a lot of times now when families ask those questions to say, well, let's not start there. Let's start somewhere else. How do you understand the problem? Like, what is it that you're actually trying to solve? And that opens the door to, rather than me saying, well, I think you should do this, which they may have tried already. And it still might be a good thing to do if the understanding was different. And so, when I wrote the book, the first words in the book are, most people write books for people family members struggling with addiction, to tell them what to do and how to do it. This book is different. This book is written to tell you why it's so hard to do the things that people tell you.
Hmm.
And it was really from the very beginning, I wanted the reader to move away from this idea of, well, I just need to know what to do, when they need to understand what's happened to me in this process.
Mm.
How have I been traumatized by my loved one's addiction, and how has my brain been hijacked, like you were talking about yours? So that I'll give you a good example. I ask families on a regular basis, so when your loved one walks in the front door of the house, how long does it take you to determine whether they're intoxicated or not? And the average answer is 2 seconds. Pretty hypervigilant.
Yeah.
And when I say that, that sounds like a trauma response to me. They immediately start talking about, well, it's really a threatening, if he's sober, then life's going to be one way. If he's intoxicated, it's going to be a really different thing. And then I ask them, okay, that makes sense. So let's just say your loved one's been sober for 2 years, year and a half, 2 years. And you haven't seen them for a while, and the door swings open. He walks in the door. How long before you think, I better check to make sure he's sober? You'd think in a year and a half, 2 years, it would have gotten longer. There'd be trust developing. There would be relationship. 2 seconds. Same answer. And that's the answer in my mind, or that's the reason in my mind why, if the family doesn't begin to recognize, like I did, that I am traumatized in this process, I have to get better. Not he needs to get better so that I can be okay. And so often we'll ask people in our group, for the family members, how was your week? And they'll say, well, my loved one had a good week this week. He's going to meetings, he's doing great, so I'm good. Or he or she's really struggling, and I'm a little bit nervous. Hey, sorry.
That's good.
Or they relapsed, and I'm really, I'm terrified. And the key for family members in that process is to begin to realize that, all of that, it's a chronic illness. All of those things are possible. But the idea, we asked, how are you doing? Not how's your loved one doing? And that idea of taking ownership of my own response to all of this, rather than...
Mike, do addicts become convenient scapegoats for dysfunctional families?
Oh, absolutely. I believe, to be quite honest, that some families have had so much addiction in prior generations that the parenting is almost, it's not anticipating it, but, how do families form? Like, it's one of the things we rarely talk about is how did this family come together? And how much addiction was there in prior generations? And how much awareness is there? We call it transgenerational trauma. And the idea of, if I had trauma when I was growing up, I would have been impacted by that trauma. And if I'm not really aware of it, I can pass those same behaviors on within my family system. And so it's not unusual at all for families to say, look, I'm just here to support my loved one. Well, that's a pretty hierarchical situation that basically says, I'm here and he's here. And even when he gets sober, if I'm still just here to support rather than, as a family, we need to heal. We love each other. We want to be in a healthy relationship with each other. And so the idea of the research is pretty clear. And this isn't just for addiction, this is for any chronic illness, that an individual with a chronic illness will manage their illness better when the whole family goes into a recovery state, where they begin to recognize that while my loved one might actually have the illness impacts all of us. And it's been impacting us for a while. And we need to find ways to interact differently. We need to communicate better. We need to realize that it's not always the loved one's issue. It might be my issue. And that when family members can begin to remove the loved one from the identified patient role and really look at, we all have symptoms, we all have been impacted, that's a much healthier, easier place for this family to begin to heal than, it's always going to be his problem. And when a person gets sober, one of three things can happen. One is the whole family begins to heal, and they begin to treat this person, like a family member, like a true equal in that system. And they're all kind of working on their own stuff, and they're all trying to deal with their own emotional struggles, the impacts, resentments, those things. If the family does not do that, then the client, the identified patient, is sort of left with a forced choice. One is, so let me go back for a second. So when I was talking about when the disease is progressing, the family's making these subtle changes. And they do that because they love the person and they're trying best to be able to tolerate living with active addiction while also trying to help them fix it. Well, if the client, the identified patient, gets sober and the family doesn't recognize, wow, we've made a lot of changes to be able to accommodate the active addiction, hypervigilance, lack of trust, secrets, talking about this person rather than to this person, that once the person gets sober, if they continue to treat them in the same way, then the person either has to relapse to fit into that, or it's going to be really uncomfortable to be treated like a problem for years, or they generally, I don't want to say write their families off, but they distance themselves from their families, and they have this kind of new family in recovery. And I was walking through the mall a while ago, and I saw a young woman and her mom walking towards me, and when they got close enough, I realized that the young woman was a former client of one of the treatment centers that I worked in before the Foundry. And when she saw me, she started telling me, her eyes got big, and she was like, I've been sober for 2.5 years, and I'm an entrepreneur. I've started 3 businesses, and they're all doing great. And she's just going on and on about all the good things. And I looked at her mom, thinking the mom would just be gleaming, and the mom was like, rolling her eyes. And I looked at the mom and I said, why are you upset when your daughter is talking about so much great, healing? And she said, well, I just need to be honest. I hate AA. And I said, why do you hate AA? She said, because it took my daughter away from me.
Mm.
And the daughter looked at the mom and said, you and dad still drink too much.
Mm.
I can't be around you. You want me to, be at these parties and things. So that's not an unusual process of negotiating, like, what is this new person's role? Not new person, but what is the person's new role in the family after they get sober? And so, I hope that all makes sense.
It does. It's
But
fascinating, and I'm struck by much earlier you said, when one person brings through something that happened to them or something that they're consciously doing, brings trauma into a family system, then immediately begins to traumatize the family system and play upon whatever existing traumas or dysfunctions were already present. And then you add to that, a multiplicity of different natural personality styles, families of origin, all kinds of things. You've got an almost infinitely complex system going on there that I would imagine almost always would need some external intervention in order to begin to make some sense of it, because you're so bound by your own limited perspective, and then you're hijacked and compromised by the presence of a new trauma. And I know in my own case, just I've found the temptation to either, let's see, what is it, rationalize, or we can rationalize away a lot of things for a long time until the moment when clearly it no longer works. And so I can't be trusted either with my own dysfunctions to accurately appraise them, nor to accurately appraise the challenges that people very close to me have. Because, like you said, if I'm going to really acknowledge that something bad is going on with someone I love dearly, then it's going to require something of a lot of us. And frankly, I think there's a part of us as humans that is, as much as we may love that person, really unwilling to inconvenience ourselves to go through what it takes to get better.
I think that. So I once had a student when I was teaching, and I think families get labeled unmotivated a lot. Like, we want them to come to the program and we want them to do all these things. And again, if they don't see themselves as part of the problem or as part of the illness, then why would they do that? And so I had a student that said, what's the best way to work with an unmotivated client? And I thought for a second, I don't like the dichotomous thinking of that. And I just said, well, I don't know that I've ever worked with an unmotivated client. I think all of my clients are highly motivated for something. And for some of them, it's staying the same. And I work with traumatized families and traumatized individuals, and what they're really motivated to do is to stay as safe as possible. And that's the deciding thing for me, is moving away from, dysfunction and controlling and all the things that people get called, to really moved into everyone's just trying to stay safe and to try to, be as in control as they can be of their own lives. And I look at enabling behaviors and things like that. And I've always been a big advocate that telling a family to stop enabling is like Nancy Reagan telling an addict to just say no. It misses the point of how complicated it is. And that so often when I talk to families about, doing things for their loved one that maybe isn't, they need to learn to do themselves, that it becomes like they talk about how fearful they are, that, what if they don't make it? And what if, they're really mad at me? And what if and it's, and then they talk about their, chest tightening and their throat tightening, and it's a sympathetic nervous system response. It's a trauma response. And so we've really done a lot to try to reconstruct the idea of enabling from this really dangerous thing that families do, to kind of recognizing that enabling is really loving behavior with boundaries that probably are trauma-related boundaries, and that because so often it's like if you have two kids and one's, the family hero type kid, you would give them money. You might help them get on their feet after college. You might let them come home and live for a while. You may do all kinds of things that with someone who is in active addiction, we might say, you need to not do that because it's going to stop them from being aware of the severity of their problem. And so I say to families on a daily basis, what if this is more complicated than you think it is? What if this is, you've created a belief system that is really the problem? Like your kind of biggest obstacle is, how do you get past your own fears? How do you get past your own beliefs? And so, and I think that's why I wrote the book, to try to, it's more of a conversation than it is, it's not very, it's really me having a conversation with them. Like, this is what's happening. And, take a step back and how does this fit for you? And so if people are really wanting to be told what to do, I can give you the name of a bunch of other books that are probably more in what they're looking for. But if they really want to look at their own trauma and their own kind of history and their own family of origin and begin to be in recovery themselves, then I think it's a pretty good resource. And this whole thing started during COVID. And I was cleaning out my garage just like everyone else was doing. And I found a box that I hadn't opened in 20 years. And I just had no idea. So I opened it, and it was all the papers that I had written while I was in my doctoral program at Florida State. And on the very top page or of the stack was an article I wrote in 1991. And it was an assessment of family services in addiction treatment. And when I read the paper, I thought, we are no further ahead than we were 30 years since I had written that paper. And I said, we're actually worse. We treat families even worse than we treated them before. And then I was looking at the paper and I realized that it was submitted to the class 40 days before Patrick got hit by the car. And I started thinking, I wonder how different that paper would have been if I already knew what I know now about families and trauma. And that it's not just a matter of treating families in terms of a loved one's addiction, but it has to also be trauma integrated, in that we help families understand the cost that they have paid, or the cost of the addiction on their own mental health. People don't know this, but there's research that says that family members of individuals with addiction start using excessive amounts of health benefits a year before the person is even diagnosed. Meaning that the stress of this kind of constantly shifting to try to deal with the next kind of catastrophe that's going to happen begins to have physical consequences on loved ones. And the families that come into our program, they do, some assessments and stuff. And they are they're exhausted. They're highly anxious. They're very full of intrusive thoughts. They can't get the loved one's well-being out of their head. They don't sleep. They have a hard time falling asleep. They have a hard time staying asleep. And, one of the things that we kind of came to in my dissertation was the idea that the longer people stay in that fight or flight response of I have to be the one that controls all of this, that they begin to think that the needs of the individual with the addiction are more important than the needs of themselves. And that is why they come in such exhausted, state. And the idea of they haven't taken care of themselves probably in years because they've been so busy. We have to tell them so often, well, the flight attendant tells you to put the mask on yourself first and then on the kids. And it's like, oh, you don't understand. This is really life and death. And
Mike, one of the things that's
so,
coming through really clearly to me, and you can tell me how accurate this is, but what I perceive is you're advocating for reserving even more judgment, for holding off on being unproductively critical early in the recovery game for both the person in active addiction and the family members, and instead having a really highly compassionate and curious approach. You mentioned enabling, and it'd be very easy to be critical of an enabling behavior in the person who's exhibiting it, but for you to say it is an attempt to be loving on the part of that person. And so how can we come alongside them and help them to acknowledge their attempts to be loving, and also help them to explore the ways in which their attempts are not actually providing a sustainable or useful solution. And I'm sort of struck by the humanity of what you're suggesting and what your approach seems to be about.
well, it sorry.
That's all right.
It's interesting. I think that's one of the biggest. So often, families who have been in other family treatment feel like they have been blamed in that process. And so given the fact that we really came at it from a trauma perspective first, and then a chronic disease perspective second, and an addiction perspective as a chronic disease third, the compassion was just naturally there. And it's funny, when I wrote the book, I wanted to write it from I'm one of you, meaning I'm a father of a person who was highly traumatized, almost died. And so, these are things I've learned along the way. And so we try to take that, not transference kind of relationship, but the understanding of these families are doing the very best they can. And they are trying to stay as safe as possible. And it's why we don't use the term codependency. We don't we don't like that term.
And Mike, when you say we, who do you mean?
My staff so I have the Michael Barnes Family Institute, which
Okay.
has a family program, and we have basically agreed that if you look at the definition of codependency and you look at the definition of developmental trauma, they're the same thing. And so codependency it has grown into almost a negative kind of, well, you're being codependent, as opposed to, no, you've been traumatized and everything you're doing makes sense. And here's what we can do to support you in this process of healing. But if you get your information from, there's so much casual information on codependency out there in magazines and, and what we call it is important, and how we frame it from a therapy standpoint is really important. So, and there's a lot of people in the field that disagree with me, and I can live with that. But I think, you had said, how do you join with these families? And we have an interesting model in that we have therapists, but we also have coaches. And our coaches do a lot of the education. They do a lot of the support, phone calls, connecting with people. They coach. And the therapists. So the first phase of that program is intended to shift a person's understanding and begin to say, oh, yeah, I've really been impacted by this. And I never realized how impacted I was by this. And I did do everything from a loving perspective. And it's not my fault. But more of the same always results in more of the same. And so I do need to begin to heal some of my responses, maybe from my own father or maybe from my own grandfather or whatever. But I have to come to terms with those things so that we as a family can heal, and this person we love so much can actually be a part of the family rather than sort of the isolated, identified problem. So,
I think a critic could accuse that approach of lacking sufficient self responsibility on the part of the participants. In that, they're saying, I did the best I could. It wasn't my fault. I'm in no way complicit in any of the things that are going on here. But I hear you saying something differently. I hear you saying, when you are aware that, yes, I was doing the best I could, and the best that I could wasn't sufficient, then you've got the opportunity to begin understanding how to evolve in the way that you're participating in that family system or with that person who's in addiction. And so you do, along the way, end up taking responsibility, and perhaps in a way that is for the individual more incrementally manageable than just saying, hey man, you blew it. Like, you were really not doing the right thing.
well, and again, why do people ask, you know, us telling them, here's what you should do? They're probably not going to do it. And so there is a process of joining and connecting and, and really helping them shift that perception of the problem to, wow, I have a problem. My problem might not be addiction. My problem may be my trauma. My problem may be my own traumas from my past. But I have to come to terms with that. And the goal is really for the whole family to make a decision to, enter recovery. So we talk about the goal of our program is to help families move away from where a family that supports a loved one who struggles with addiction to where a family in recovery from addiction and trauma. And it seems subtle, but it's not. It's a huge shift. And it's the difference between, like, sometimes our clients will say, the clients in addiction treatment will say to their parents or to their families, you don't need to go to the family program. This isn't your problem. This is my problem. And just, you're great. You're fine. It's all me. And so we were having a conversation in group the other day with the families about, well, what do you say to that? And I said, well, what do you say to that? Like, when they ask you, what have you been saying? And they were all saying how they affirm with their loved one that we're here to support you. And I said, wonder how that feels for your loved one to have your family going through all this just to support you. And if I'm only here to support them, why do I need to change? I'm not the one with the problem. And I said, if you really want to be able to say to your loved one, no. I'm learning so much in this program about me, and that I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. And that I realize my own trauma now. I realize these things, and that we're going to heal as a family, as opposed to we're going to wait for you to heal so we can go back to normal.
Yeah, going from, even if it's compassionate, the finger pointing you, to the responsible we.
Yes.
I would imagine that is, as you say, a titanic shift. I mean, a seismic shift in the way that a family begins to relate to each other and individuals relate to themselves.
And people think that what the families are going through and what the clients are going through are different. And in many cases, it's really not. They go through the same denial. They go through the same. They need to understand that there is an element of powerlessness, which doesn't mean helplessness. It means if I continue to focus on things the same way I have, my ability to shift things and change things becomes pretty limited. And so if I just keep trying to do it the same way, it's going to fail, because more of the same always results in more of the same. And so that's our goal, that everyone is, like, no one's to blame, because it's not a blame scenario, but everyone is responsible, as you were kind of talking about, to take the steps that they need to take to be healthy, not just for their loved one, but for their own lives, for the rest of their life.
I mean, it probably is on the level of a presupposition for me. I mean, it's so fundamental to the way that I approach life and how to live well, is that an important objective for each of us as individuals is to be 100% responsible for ourselves and appropriately responsible for others. Mm-hmm. And were each of us to get even close to perfection in that regard, the world would be a much different place. Because I think there's a sense in which you could describe the problems of the world as a infinitely complex combination of under and over responsibility on the part of people interacting.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think the only caveat to that is if my brain has been hijacked,
Mm-hmm.
then I may see being hypervigilant as me being responsible for my safety.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of if I like that's why we want to educate the families in the idea of what does responsibility look like, what and how has their primary previous perceptions of the problem actually been the solution that has created where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And once they can make that shift, then it really is about personal responsibility. But it's kind of a reframe of what they have come to believe. So it's
Mike,
complicated. It is
it's
complicated.
very complicated. It's very complicated. I mean, human dynamics are just, again, infinitely complicated. I mean, me and you interacting right here isn't just the function of two people sitting across Zoom talking. You're bringing all of who you are innately and all of who you have become as a result of your life experiences, your choices, successes in assuming responsibility, failures in assuming. I mean, you and I are both bringing that whole thing to this conversation today. And, hopefully in good faith and with mutual regard, you and I have done our best to bring our best to this conversation as honestly as we know how. And even then, the depths of who we are and what we're really after remain substantially hidden from us. But better to push into the fray and to attempt to sort some of this out than to stay away from it, because avoiding it only brings about more calamity. With your permission, I want to wrap up where we started, which is back with your son's accident.
Mm-hmm.
And with the benefit of 32 years of hindsight and really life's work that has in some way related to your experience, how has that experience influenced your path in life, your relationship to life and death? What are you aware of? And that can be personally and professionally.
Well, I think personally, I spent a long time as the absent-minded professor, and that I stayed in my head. I was a thinker. I loved theory. I loved to teach. I didn't like to look at myself very much, meaning there was so much trauma. And what the accident, and not just the accident, but years following the accident, it has really made me more able to begin to look at myself and to realize that I I've I thought that I had resolved it, and I hadn't. And so I've gone back to therapy multiple times and spent a lot of time continuing to work on it, even completely independent of Patrick. And he's done the same thing. Professionally, my son and I have a business together, and he's a lawyer, and we do training on trauma-informed legal practice, and the idea of how do we take what we have learned into law, and the idea that law is constantly re-traumatizing clients just by the way they carry out their business. And I think that's the thing for Patrick, is that he was going to leave the legal profession until he began to realize, that he's learned so much. Now he's thriving in it, doing trauma-informed legal practice, really treating clients very much like we treat clients in the counseling world. And so I've watched him
Wow,
really
I
mature.
bet that is a very different experience for the client. My goodness.
Yep. And then together, you know, I've never experienced a close relationship like I have with Patrick. That we have, it's father-son for sure, but it's also incredibly collaborative, and he's as much there for me as I am there for him. And I don't know that it would have been that way without this trauma, without the history and without the growth So it's transformational,
Hmm.
to be quite honest. So
Well, I believe that our purpose, our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable. And you're yet another example of how reliable that statement is. And it is informed that your story with Patrick has informed the way that you do the work you do. It's informed the work that you've continued to do. It's informed, the ways in which you've been able to help people. And it's so cool to see. And so I invite our listeners and our viewers to consider their own stories to the degree that they haven't, and to become more intimately acquainted with it. And in the case of existing traumas that have hijacked you and not been dealt with, I hope you will take Mike's words to heart and heed them and realize, unless you're willing to slow down and take the steps that are necessary to liberate yourself from that hijacking, it will continue to bear sour fruit in your life and in the lives of others around you. And that's not the whole story. There's redemptive things in all of our experiences that are available. But, more commonly than not, unresolved trauma will yield additional trauma and perpetuate the cycle. So if you're listening and realizing that shoe fits you, and that you are potentially perpetuating more trauma upon yourself and others around you, then summon the courage and the humility and the truth telling, the first three of the big six, to take a step and do something now. And Mike, what might be a good first step for someone who's being given some insights based upon what you've shared today?
well, I think reading the book is a pretty comprehensive. It starts with addiction and then moves to it starts with how families form, and then goes to addiction and kind of walks them through the whole process. I mean,
Where's the best place to get the book? Where do you want people to get the book from?
they can get it from my website, drmikebarnes.com.
Okay.
I think get it from Amazon. I mean, there's a lot of places you can get it. Also, I have a lot of videos on my YouTube channel that people could, or if they're interested in learning more about trauma, if they're interested in learning more about how families are impacted, it's all open. Anyone can watch them. It's a good place to kind of start to begin to say, is this really, like, do I relate to any of this? And the last thing is, they can call me. I'm happy to point them in a direction of where I think they could or should go. And, there's resources all over the country. We have a whole team of people that find resources around the country to, if we can't help them, then we want to find someone who can.
And I will include Mike's information in the show notes for this episode. But briefly, Mike, where would one-stop shopping be? Is it drmichaelbarnes.com? Is that one-stop shopping? That
Yeah,
will get people everything they need.
there's an opportunity in there to connect with me, to send me an email, and I'll get right back to them.
Great. Let me see if there's anything else. Will you share briefly the professional ecosystem you're operating in right now, and describe how they relate to one another, so for listeners' benefit?
So I was the chief clinical officer for a treatment center in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, called the Foundry. And recently we have really grown exponentially, and we're building a new treatment center in Denver, and we have outpatient programs. And when we made that shift, I had started the Michael Barnes Family Institute, which is a family service center and a program
And
that
that's the we you
work.
refer that's the we you
Yeah,
referred to earlier, right? Okay.
yeah. And I've relinquished my chief clinical officer role to someone else so that I can focus full time on working with families. And so the Michael Barnes Family Institute is part of the Foundry. It's a subsidiary of the holding company that owns all of the other programs. And so I'm still a clinical advisor for the addiction side, but 90% of my time is on the family program. So it was a fully remote program. Now it's an app that families can actually walk through all the stages that we would go through in a program, with a coach supporting you through that process. So that's that's my passion at this point.
Right.
That's all I do.
And you are someone who has persisted in attempting to help find even better solutions to some of the most persistent problems that we face as humans. And that's so meaningful, Mike. Thank you for persisting in that work. It is challenging, it's rewarding, it's complex, but what an adventure you've been on. And, we all get to reap the rewards of the adventure as it continues. So thank you. And thank you for taking time with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure, as always. I love talking to you.
And for everyone listening and watching, remember, as always, you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So get after it.